Megatron, one of, if not the, most enduring antagonists in all of Transformers fiction. Whether depicted as being totally insane or having a strategic mind without equal, Megatron has always been a villain's villain, maniacally laughing from one Saturday morning scheme to the next in his bid for world conquest. He'd been a relatively straightforward arch-villain since Beat 1, and the few glimpses into the early days of the character seemingly showed someone who was simply born evil. That changed when writer and game designer Eric Holmes crafted a more complicated backstory for Megatron as part of IDW's 2005 Comics Continuity. As he told comicbookresources.com, "I firmly believe that any villain has to be the hero of his own story. Nobody sets out to be evil or decides to be bad. They have their own values arrived at through their own life experience." This approach in defining Megatron as a product of his environment and experiences may not seem all that groundbreaking or special nowadays, but back in 2007, it stood in stark contrast to how the Decepticon leader had been cast up to that point, challenging the clean division between good and evil and prompting the question, what if Megatron wasn't always the bad guy? June 2007 saw the release of the first issue of Megatron Origin. The series would go on to be fairly influential both for future IDW stories as well as Hasbro's aligned continuity, which is kind of funny in retrospect as this series had virtually no impact on the comics released in its wake until James Roberts and Alex Milne revisited Megatron's early days during the Chaos Theory 2-part story in 2011. Although Megatron Origin debuted in 2007, the story had been working its way towards publication for quite some time beforehand. The writer for the series, Eric Holmes, primarily works in the video game industry, but in the early 2000s he decided to try his hand at comic book writing and began pitching his idea for a Megatron Origin story to Dreamwave Productions, who held the license to publish Transformers comics at the time. Holmes said that Dreamwave liked the idea enough to consider turning it into an ongoing series, which is wild to think about what could have been had that panned out. Though, on the other hand, considering Dreamwave's unceremonious collapse, which left their Transformers stories unfinished and much of their talent unpaid, maybe it's for the best that Megatron Origin never got off the ground during the Dreamwave era. Regardless, Holmes was stockpiling ideas. In a behind-the-scenes write-up in Volume 33 of Hachette's definitive G1 collection series, Holmes estimates that he, quote, probably had enough material for 10 or more issues because I was just stuffing it full of ideas. After the license passed to IDW Publishing in 2005, Holmes pitched the story again to then editor-in-chief Chris Ryle, who agreed to publish the story as a miniseries. Also in that Hachette feature, Holmes remembers early titles such as Transformers Precursor and Transformers World on Fire. This seems to mostly line up with information posted on Wikipedia and TFW 2005, which states that Ryle officially announced the series under the title Megatron Precursor, though Ryle's post on the old IDW forums appears to be lost to time as the Wayback Machine can't pull up the dead links still listed on Wikipedia and TFW. In any case, the title of the series obviously changed, as did the length, pulling back from the mind-blowing possibility of an ongoing series with 10-plus issues of material to 6, and then whittled down further into 4 issues. The fact that there was a change from 6 to 4 issues was revealed in a March 2015 Transmissions podcast interview with More Than Meets the Eye and Lost Light writer James Roberts' response to the interviewer's comments and questions about Megatron Origin. From the outside looking in, it seems like a tumultuous road to getting the story published, and I think Holmes deserves some credit for persevering and seeing it through, giving us a fairly unique 4-issue entry into IDW's Transformers continuity. The story of Megatron Origin begins at Mining Outpost C-12, a facility on a planet that will later in the continuity be known as Crotius-12. A Cybertronian senator named Decimus has just arrived on site to lay off all the workers in order to automate the mine's operations. Right off the bat, Decimus and by extension Cybertron's ruling elite are established as cold-hearted autocrats, with Decimus musing on the politics of resource allocation and maintaining control over the populace, and how the needs and concerns of the workers do not play into his calculus. Decimus concludes his cruel pontifications with, "At the end of the cycle, you're right, they won't like it, but perhaps you're confusing me with someone who cares. That's what our security is for, That security team seems to be led by a large, unnamed bot who bears resemblance to Grand Maximus, a redeco of Fortress Maximus from the Japanese Transformers continuity. Whatever his name here, during the assembly, this bot silences the protests of an angry miner, fatally wounding him, which agitates the crowd even further. What's interesting here is that this security officer is holding a riot shield with an Autobot insignia, and even flashes a holographic badge of the iconic emblem, warning the unruly crowd, "For your own protection. Can't you people see this? Now get back." This is part of what makes Megatron Origin so compelling. This effectively plants some pretty nasty skeletons in the closets of the heroic Autobots we all know and love. Although they aren't called Autobots just yet, the soon-to-be faction is nonetheless recast as a brutal law enforcement agency that serves an oppressive regime of corrupt and greedy senators. Megatron, meanwhile, is reimagined as one of the miners, being told he's now redundant and out of a job, watching on as one of these proto-Autobots murders one of his fellow workers for speaking out against the Senate. And he snaps, wounding the senator and killing the Grand Maximus lookalike, beginning a chain of events that will lead him down the path to becoming the Decepticon leader who has an unshakable faith in the ethos of peace through tyranny. With the help of Rumble and Frenzy, Megatron hijacks a prisoner transport shuttle and returns to Cybertron, slipping into the seedy underground of the Cybertronian city-state known as Kaon. There, he becomes a fighter in illegal gladiatorial matches where he excels and quickly gains prominence and notoriety, fashioning his fellow fighters into a movement, catching the attention of Sentinel Prime, commander of this pre-Autobot force. Sentinel Prime and Prowl attempt to put a stop to the fighting rings and bring Megatron to justice. Things take a real turn for the worse, however, when Sentinel seemingly gets his wish and brings in Megatron and his followers, but Megatron allowed his forces to be caught, pulling a deception to get close enough to the Kaon Council to murder them and overthrow the government, with Megatron defeating Sentinel Prime single-handedly and driving the security forces out of Kaon. That's the gist. I obviously left out quite a few specifics and details of the plot because there's a lot of other stuff that I think is worth talking about. And this take on Megatron, specifically his trajectory from working-class citizen to gladiator to Decepticon warlord, would have a notable impact on Phase 2 and James Roberts' take on the character, but it also made its way into the aligned continuity around 2010, as well as the 2019 IDW continuity, and probably other things that I'm forgetting at the moment. As far as I'm aware, Megatron Origin was the first attempt to situate Megatron's despotic turn as springing forth from a corrupt and unjust society, and I think the series deserves some credit for that. However you feel about this series or the overall scope of its influence, it's undeniable that it had an impact on how one of the core characters of the franchise is portrayed. But it's also a series that draws on previous fiction in some endearing and interesting ways. The first clear example is the Dreamwave continuity. Eric Holmes was heavily inspired by Dreamwave undertakings such as Simon Furman's War Within series, and saw potential in telling a similar story, but with a twist. As Holmes wrote out in the aforementioned Hachette volume, "I loved everything about the War Within, but it was very much the story of Optimus and how he came to be inside a conflict that had already been rolling for some time. In the War Within, Megatron was, unlike Prime, much the same as he's always always been. So I got excited about doing for Megatron what Simon did for Prime. In that story, Optimus goes from a character who makes an unpopular first decision as the new Prime to surrender Cybertron to the Decepticons to the unyielding defender that we'd expect him to be. So you can kind of see what Holmes is talking about here, but there are some other interesting connections as well. In a brief flashback that appeared in issue 10 of Dreamwave's Transformers Generation 1, the final issue of the series, we get a glimpse of who Megatron was before the war started, which establishes some similarities between what the intent was likely to be at Dreamwave and what ended up being published by IDW. It's fascinating to see elements teased in this flashback sequence that were ported over to the IDW continuity, like Megatron's gladiatorial markings on his helmet, which, while not exactly the same, are far too similar to not have been a source of inspiration, or this little GoBots Easter egg with Megatron squaring off against Psykill in the Dreamwave flashback, which would inexplicably be revisited with a full fight sequence in the IDW series. I've pointed out in previous videos how Dreamwave influenced and impacted the IDW continuity, but in most cases it was primarily cosmetic, with the pre-dinosaur Dinobots and Stormbringer Optimus Prime taking design cues from their past incarnations. And that tradition continues here with more than a few design cues plucked straight from War Within, including Grimlock, Ravage, Ironhide. Even though we don't see much of him, I think you could even make the case that Marcelo Matere's Scrapper from Megatron Origin was inspired by Figueroa's War Within redesign, with the orientation of the bucket of his front loader alt mode, but you be the judge. Anyway, all these examples are not necessarily exactly the same as Figueroa's designs, but they certainly seem to be similar enough to assume there was some inspiration taken, though in the case of Scrapper in issue 2, that seems to vary by artist. Funnily enough, when the art switches back to Alex Milne a few pages later, the bucket has mysteriously moved back to its usual look. And the idea of a humanoid version of Ratbat that appeared in War Within the Dark Ages could also be an inspiration for Senator Ratbat, though the designs are completely different, so that could just be a coincidence. Then there's a page with a lot to unpack, which we'll do later, but the part I want to highlight now is that we see an interesting pair of characters who appear to be reminiscent of Optronics and Optimus Prime from War Within, but seeing as how Figueroa updated that design for Stormbringer, I think this is just a coincidence. If you look closely, you can see that this Orion Pax Optimus figure is holding a helmet that seems to have his characteristic antenna, and on the following page does not have a mouthplate, both of which are different from the Dreamwave Optronics version of the character. However, there are two of them, and the white variant is obviously a nod to the Generation 1 Ultra Magnus toy, which essentially was a white and blue Prime that could attach to the trailer to form the Ultra Magnus armor. Again, it's tempting to look for an association with the Dreamwave continuity here, which fully embraced the original play features of the G1 toy for its fiction by making Ultra Magnus and Optimus brothers, but again, this is likely coincidental, and I think Milne is referencing the G1 toy first and foremost. Regardless, this specific nod to G1 Ultra Magnus was never picked up by any subsequent creative team, and this particular officer was never seen again, so he has no concrete bearing on the IDW version of Ultra Magnus, despite that character eventually being shown to be an Autobot within armor. Despite doing some new and interesting things with the character, there's a very similar feel to the broad strokes of Megatron's early days in the Marvel Comics continuity. Hailing from Scotland, Holmes grew up reading the Marvel UK continuity of Transformers, where he was exposed to Simon Furman's work with the franchise, so it certainly seems possible that he may have read State Games, a prose story by James Hill with select illustrations by John Stokes that appeared in the 1986 Transformers UK annual. State Games was set prior to the outbreak of the Great War, establishing the enduring trope of Megatron as a gladiatorial champion who played a key role in overturning the old ways of Cybertronian society and ushering in a new era of conflict. State Games and Megatron Origin share several superficial elements: Sunstreaker's presence and interest in the gladiatorial games, a system that failed its citizens and ultimately created the conditions for the Decepticons to flourish. It's all familiar in a very satisfying way that pays tribute to what came before, but there's still a good deal that separates Megatron Origin from previous fiction. Up until that point, the franchise had fallen into a kind of de facto regal mysticism in regards to Cybertronian origins, pre-war society, as well as the ideas of destiny and prophecy. Think of the High Circuit Master Boltax from the Flames of Boltax, or the Council from War Within, or even the Matrix and the Underbase. All examples of how Cybertronian authority and artifacts are often intertwined with space opera religion or mysticism. Even the overlords in state games, while not overtly connected to mysticism, seem to represent a kind of regal nobility more akin to rulers than politicians, which is important to note because the IDW continuity under Furman's guidance took a step away from a lot of that stuff, although obviously not completely. This is Furman we're talking about. It's always a safe bet the guy will work mysticism into his Transformers story somehow, but overall, the early days of the IDW continuity were relatively grounded in comparison to previous fiction. Megatron Origin really hammered that home by omitting mysticism and regal authorities for the most part, substituting in their place a corrupt ruling class of senators. In interviews at the time, it was stated that Furman helped bring the script of Megatron Origin into alignment with the IDW continuity. I don't doubt that Furman was involved, but to be honest, I have no idea what kind of input he had here, as there's nothing in this story that, in my opinion, clearly ties into anything that Furman was working on with his titles at the time. If I had to guess, and this is pure speculation on my part, I'd say Furman's contributions were more subtractive rather than additive, resulting in the removal of elements that would contradict the lore, world building, or overall tone that Furman was working with. Remember, at this point in time, there was no intention of having Primus or Unicron in the IDW continuity under Furman. Oops. And even that ubiquitous franchise MacGuffin, The Matrix, would have been off limits due to Furman's unrealized plans for it. I can't help but wonder if Holmes had originally intended to use elements that would not have gelled with Furman's vision. For example, maybe originally having an entity similar to the Council from War Within, only to have to change it to corrupt senators. I have nothing to base that off of. I'm just wondering about details that might have been modified as the story moved from Dreamwave to IDW. Regardless, I can't imagine this story being told any other way. The end result is what I would consider to be the most deeply political story in Transformers Comics up to that point, showing how the Proto-Autobot security forces and the Senate created the conditions that fueled Megatron's ascent and the violent uprising in Kaon. As Starscream puts it while addressing the Kaon Council in issue 4, you didn't just make it possible, you made it happen. All we did was give it a badge. Of course, the Decepticons bear ultimate responsibility for their own actions, but the point is the Senate and the law enforcement agency could have prevented or lessened all of it. The Senate pushed desperate people to the breaking point and ensured that these down-and-out citizens had nowhere to turn and nothing to lose. So I don't think that they're completely blameless here. I don't think it's difficult to sympathize with Megatron's plight or to understand the motivations behind some of his actions, especially early on in the series. And it's much harder to sympathize with the Senate, considering the flat-out disregard they show for the people beneath them. For some of them, it's even a game. Ratbat actively destabilizes Cybertronian society and causes suffering, all to enrich himself. The hubris and corruption on display makes it almost impossible not to root for Megatron, and he's a far cry from a respectable protagonist. You know things are bad when the guy who stomps their enemies' faces into mush is the lesser of two evils. Sympathetic or not, this being a prequel, we know how this story ends. Megatron's revolution only brings death. Fast forward to the present-day timeline of the IDW continuity, and Megatron has become a warlord, ending countless lives. devastating multiple worlds, including Cybertron, and causing untold suffering, arguably becoming even more monstrous than the oppressive regime that he toppled. One could view Megatron Origin as a condemnation of both oppressive regimes and violent revolution, seeing as how nothing good comes out of Megatron's takeover, even though major societal change was desperately needed on Cybertron. Sounds weird to say this, but that struggle for the soul of Cybertronian society is realized and depicted beautifully, with some truly awe-inspiring visuals. The art for Megatron Origin is primarily by Alex Milne, with an assist by Marcelo Matere in issue number 2. I've talked about Matere's work with IDW Comics before in the previous retrospective video where I looked at Spotlight Soundwave, and his contributions here are limited but pretty well done. I don't find the switch mid-issue to be overly disruptive, as Matere is also operating in that detailed, blocky robot aesthetic. While Matere's line work is solid, I want to focus on Milne, who draws the bulk of this series. Alex Milne was still relatively new on the scene of Transformers Comics by this point, having previously contributed to Dreamwave's Energon series, as well as the Devil's Due G.I. Joe Transformers series Art of War. We've seen his work in the retrospective in the form of alternate covers for Spotlight Cup and Spotlight Galvatron, but Megatron Origin marks his first gig doing interior art for IDW's 05 Transformers Continuity. Milne is one of my favorite Transformers artists, probably my favorite if I'm being honest, which doesn't mean that I love every choice he makes or that I think his work is flawless, but I'm hard-pressed to think of a Transformers comics artist whose output continuously hits the kinds of notes I personally love to see in Transformers art. Milne's artwork draws me into a story in a way that few Transformers artists can pull off. He makes the world of his comics feel expansive and lived in. His line work is often ridiculously, absurdly detailed. His panels are frequently loaded to the gills with superfluous yet beautiful world-building touches and scene-setting background imagery, or, as is the case with this series, copious Easter eggs. Speaking of whatever input Furman might have had on the script in terms of keeping with continuity, I think it would be safe to assume that Alex Milne was given a wide berth with his visual Easter eggs, because there's a lot of stuff in Megatron Origin that's completely out of continuity, like Monstructor and Straxus, who really shouldn't be present in this story, as they were both off the field long before the time frame of this series, and the presence of Alita 1 and Chromia will eventually prove to be impossible once the characters are officially introduced several years later, to say nothing of the fact that the existence of female Transformers in general contradicts what Furman will eventually try to establish with Spotlight RC. So yeah, not exactly airtight as far as continuity goes. Maybe there wasn't enough time to change the line art, or maybe the editors just didn't care that much about continuity errors. Maybe a mix of the two. I don't know. I mean, Outback made it into the final version of the series where he dies as a side effect of Megatron's foot falling onto his face, despite IDW already publishing a story where Outback died much later in the in-universe chronology on a remote planet in Spotlight Cup. And they fixed this mistake by simply renaming the character in Megatron Origin to Fastback. So, yay! Continuity crisis averted. Mission accomplished. But even when it's contradicting continuity, Milne's artwork is stunning. It's busy, dense, and complex. So much so that it almost gives you carpal tunnel syndrome or other repetitive stress injuries just looking at it. Admittedly, that complexity can be a double-edged sword on occasion. There are times when I have to take a moment to look at some of Milne's panels or double splash pages just to fully decipher what's going on. That's not always a bad thing necessarily, and it's usually worth a little bit of extra effort sometimes needed to untangle. Still, Milne's work here is what I would consider to be early Milne. Make no mistake, he still cranks out some truly lovely panels here, but the clarity and the ease of readability is not quite at the same level as his later work, like this panel of Megatron tripping the security officer early on in issue number 1, or this one of Rumble or Frenzy, whatever, transforming his arms into pile drivers, or the bulk of this fight from issue 2, which really highlights the problem as the action is more than a little confusing at times. And to be fair, maybe the confusing bits shouldn't all be put at Milne's feet. After all, Holmes was inexperienced in writing specifically for comic books, which is different than writing for other mediums. While I think Holmes' work as a writer is overall worthy of praise, his script may have contributed to some of these convoluted layouts and/or action sequences. And then there's the color work, which is interesting to say the least. My feelings on the colors in this series are complicated. There are several points throughout this book where the color palette is muted and faded, almost to the point of being monochromatic. There are plenty of examples, but I think this panel highlights the issue perfectly, with the shuttle using virtually the same color palette as the city in the background, and elements like the clouds or the blue of the thrusters are so subtly different that they fail to stand out. The whole composition is kind of turned into mush as a result. This choice sometimes makes it difficult to figure out what you're supposed to be getting out of a particular panel, or it can kind of lead to things looking a bit dull, or like things are bleeding together. And even when there's more contrast, like this panel where Megatron is being arrested, it's somehow still too subtle to really break up this almost overbearing abundance of gray. The green inhibitor claw and the reddish smoke seem like they should make this pop more than it does. Megatron is the focal point here, but instead of being the most prominent figure on the page, the color work almost flattens him into the characters in front of and behind him, who in turn blend into the background, creating this block of similar colors where nothing really stands out. And yeah, maybe the composition is too busy and cluttered, but the colors are certainly not helping. However, this is where my feelings get complicated, as I think the dark, dreary, muted, and perhaps drab color work is, on the whole, a good fit for the overall tone of Megatron Origin, as well as the dingy setting of Kaon. Maybe it just needed to be executed a little differently in certain parts to be more effective, because unfortunately, rather than being given a boost by the color work as you'd expect, there are times where life and energy seem to almost be sucked out of these images. The color work is also what I would consider to be inconsistent, which I suppose is to be expected considering that multiple parties contributed colors to this series. You'll be reading an issue when, out of nowhere, you flip a page and those muddy colors give way to brighter ones. And you would think those instances with the brighter colors would resolve the issues I outlined above, right? Well, there's just one problem. They don't look good. While the colors in these sections are brighter and more vivid, they're harsh and garish, and they just show up in the middle of the story before disappearing again. It's clear that there was no overarching guiding vision being followed for the colors in this series, or even any attempt to match what the other guy was doing, which no doubt explains the jarring differences and sometimes incoherent use of color. I think Josh Perez's colors turned out the best, and the second issue, the only one where Perez was flying solo, is the strongest in terms of color. His vision for the color work in this series, though flawed in other ways that I've already touched on, is ultimately more refined and a better fit for the line art and the script. There are soaring highs here as well, though. Despite being restricted to a limited number of areas, Milne does an awesome job of making the locations feel alive. The Cybertronian society on display here is more robust, varied, and intriguing than the one we saw in War Within, in my opinion. Obviously, the script provides some of this with the Senators, Sentinels' forces, Cybertron's affluent citizens, and the Undercity gladiators giving us a distinct sense of stratification to Cybertronian society, but Milne brings it all to life in a pretty neat way. There are these cool bits towards the end of the first issue when the hijacked shuttle descends into Kaon. We get these lovely images of a bustling, super detailed industrial cityscape with towers reaching into the sky, highways, and plenty of neon signage dotting the lower levels, giving us a glimpse of what could be Cybertronian advertising and providing nice little touches of world building as well as a nod to Kremzik from the G1 cartoon. cartoon. And despite the coloring issues I've highlighted, even using a panel from this very sequence I'm about to praise, color work on these pages does deserve some credit as it contributes to the storytelling in effective thematic ways. The upper city is clean, smooth, and bathed in light to the point of being almost gilded, whereas the undercity is shadowy and dark, with more textured color applied to complement the more weathered line art provided by Milne. Thanks to the color work, these undercity segments give the impression of being shrouded in fog, or maybe smog would be more appropriate. In any case, this stark contrast between the shimmering, immaculate world above and the dingy, dark, neon-illuminated world below is executed really well by the creative team here, and does quite a bit to set the tone and reinforce the themes of this series, as well as clearly demonstrate the Cybertronian class system in play. I still think they could have gotten this across in a way that didn't compromise the readability, but I digress. I've already touched on Milne's tendency to throw in Easter eggs, and sure, some of those might fly in the face of continuity, but it's still fun to see what he packs into his panels. There are plenty of future Autobots and Decepticons that are just thrown in for flavor, like Grimlock, Motormaster, the Battle Chargers, the Predacons, and so on, and that's to say nothing of the all-new original characters that Milne adds in, of which there are plenty, really contributing to making this world feel alive. But the big one I want to focus on is this splash page from issue number 3, showing Sentinel's forces gathered around for Bumper and Fastback's funeral. On his DeviantArt page, Milne asked his followers to name everybody in this image, and between that and TF Wiki, we have almost a complete picture of who's here, but it's still not quite definitive. As of the making of this video, TF Wiki is still missing a couple of names and even has some wrong, as Milne would show in some of his responses. The first, Blades, is understandable as the character appeared in issue number 2, but Milne identified this character as Air Raid, which makes sense to me considering this looks like the nose cone of an aerial bot. The other mistake is that the TF Wiki page mentions Mirage as being present here, which he's not. This is again understandable because the coloring isn't making anything easier, and complicating things further is that Milne made a choice here to put certain characters in suits of power armor. So Brawn and Warpath are both shown here in armor, and this guy must be Powerglide considering Milne said he was both in this image and on the right hand side of it, which I can kind of see it with the wings on the side of the head like the G1 character model, but yeah, not the easiest to pick out. The last one, who seems to remain unidentified on either the TF Wiki entry or the DeviantArt page, is this guy here, who looks a lot like Blitzwing or a variant of Blitzwing colored blue. Placement of the turret, the wings, the one triangle on the part of the chest that is visible. I'm at a loss on who else it could possibly be. Blitzwing or a variant is actually a really cool Easter egg to add to the scene, because obviously he does not go on to become an Autobot, but this actually turns into a cool bit of continuity, even if it was unintentional, I don't know. As years later, Blitzwing and another Blitzwing variant with a different color scheme would be shown to be part of the Senate's Triorian Guard in issue number 11 of More Than Meets the Eye, illustrated by none other than Alex Milne. The flashback sequences in the Shadowplay arc and Megatron Origin are set fairly near to each other chronologically, shortly before Sentinel, who is still leader of the security forces at that time, becomes Sentinel Prime. Whoever he is, given the Triorian Guard connection to the Senate, it makes sense why this character would be present at the funeral for two security officers that also served the Senate. The teams likely would have coordinated and worked together. That's a nice touch. Another nice instance of the script and art working together in tandem that I want to bring attention to involves how Megatron does not seem to be ruthless, violent, and power-hungry from the drop. I think Holmes does a pretty nice job of linking Megatron's ascent as a leader to his descent into violence and killing. Initially, Megatron is stunned by taking a life, even later asserting that it was an accident. I don't know about you, but that's not the sort of crisis of conscience I expect to see Megatron having. But I think it adds some welcomed depth to the character and illustrates how this is not yet the Megatron we're most familiar with. This remorse doesn't get much traction in the text beyond the first issue, as violence soon becomes a way of life for Megatron, but Milne provides a bit of visual ambiguity throughout that almost anchors the imagery to this introductory idea. There are several points throughout the story where we see Megatron's face downcast with his eyes draped in shadows. It conveys a wealth of potential meaning without committing to any one meaning in particular. Is Megatron feeling shame, regret, anger, surprise at how much he's enjoying doing the things he's doing? Or do these moments mark points of no return that help shape Megatron into the character we see in Infiltration and Escalation? The specific meaning is really open to the reader's interpretation, and that ambiguity paved the way for James Roberts' interpretation of the character, in my opinion. It's hard for me to look at this image of Megatron staring at his reflection in the pool of energon leaking from the bodies of the officers he just killed and not feel like the door was left open for another writer to take it a step further and show that Megatron used to be a totally different sort of person, one that wasn't pure evil and had a conscience, and was even a pacifist. The additions by Roberts later on retroactively add some poignancy to moments like this, where the visual ambiguity is leveraged to show that the Megatron that might have been is slipping away as he moves further and further into the world of the gladiatorial matches and his new persona. While there are a number of positives that make Megatron Origin worthwhile, I personally feel like it's a bit of a mess at times. There are definitely highs and lows. Overall, it feels a bit inconsistent and somewhat rushed. I wouldn't have minded seeing more of a journey with Megatron's development here. I think they could have taken more time with it. It feels like this series was not given enough time in the oven, which is ironic considering how long this thing had been planned. There are a lot of promising ideas here, but the execution doesn't always rise to the occasion. Part of that might be that there just wasn't enough space and care given to this series to allow that promise to really shine. I don't know. It's a flawed series, but that doesn't mean it's bad. I think Megatron Origins succeeds in spite of its numerous problems. I mean, it made it onto my personal list of top 10 comics from this continuity for a reason. It's a terrific concept for a Transformers comic with an engrossing setting as well as a plethora of engaging and exciting ideas. It focuses on one of the most popular characters in the franchise, and it's penciled by one of the best Transformers comics artists of all time. This series is, in my opinion, really good, but it should have been legendary. It should have set the world of Transformers comics on fire, and I think if some things had been handled differently, it could have done so. What makes it sting the most is that this was the first and last foray into Transformers comics by Eric Holmes, or any comics for that matter. So it's a bummer to hear that the guy originally had 10 plus issues worth of ideas for this series, as well as other ideas for different comics. I'm sure Holmes is busy with his chosen profession, and I can't fault him for focusing on that, but I also can't help but feel like we missed out on some truly great stories from a writer who had a lot of potential. Has the opportunity just not presented itself? Is Holmes just too busy? Or did the experience of bringing Megatron Origin into the world prove to be more than Holmes wanted to take on again? We may never know. I imagine everyone has their preferred creators that they'd like to see return to Transformers comics, and for me, when it comes to writers, Eric Holmes is one of the names I would certainly like to see make a comeback. He was just getting started with Megatron Origin, and I think he had much more to offer. Here's hoping that someday we'll get to see some more of Holmes' ideas materialize in comic book form, as I certainly would like to read them. And that takes us to the end of this retrospective video. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. I hope you got something out of it. I appreciate your patience. This one took a bit longer than I would have liked to get out. Hopefully it was worth the wait. Anyway, looking at the runtime of this, I think that's certainly enough from me for now. So thanks again. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.